Call for this work session for the Washoe County School District Board of Trustees. Madam Clerk,
All right, thank you. President Taylor,
I'm here.
Vice President Andrew Cadell. I am here. Trustee Calvert. Trustee Church.
Here via Zoom due to a COVID quarantine. Sorry, I feel great, but quarantined.
Trustee Nicolette.
Here.
Trustee Thigpen.
Here.
And student Victoria Gomez, not here. Okay.
She'll be with us later.
We certainly have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. We're going to rise for our Pledge of Allegiance, and I'm going to go ahead and ask our Deputy Chief General Counsel, Chris Reich, if he will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Mr. Wright. And thank you for being here today. We're going to start with any public comment we have for this work session, JJ?
I don't have any at the moment, but I think there was a gentleman who was considering it. But
Okay.
I don't know where he went.
Well, there'll be another opportunity, as we know, as we get towards the end. So thank you. Thank you, JJ. So we're going to go get right into adopting our agenda. Looking for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented from my colleagues, if it's your pleasure.
So moved. Diane Nicolette.
Thank you, Dr. Nicolette. Is there a second? Thank you, Trustee Manello. We have a motion and a second. Discussion? All those in favor, please signify so by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposition? Okay, the motion's carried, and thank you, Trustee Church, for chiming right in on time. Okay, we'll go on to let the record show that the motion is unanimous. It passed unanimously. We're going to go into get into agenda item 2.10, which is why we are here. Presentation by staff and discussion by the board regarding the district's fiscal year 21-22 budget process and the status. Update on state and federal funding revenue. Update on federal state and federal funding, revenue and expenditure estimates for the general fund, and recommended next steps for the budget process, and also consideration of possible direction to the superintendent and staff. This is for discussion and possible action. And I will turn it over to our presenters. I think we're going to have most of this via Zoom. Mr. Mark Mathers, who is our CFO, as well as Jeff Boswell, who is our budget director. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam President, Dr. McNeil, trustees. We are happy to be able to present this budget presentation to you. We have more information, fortunately, for you than we did last month. So, as you said, Madam President, we'll get right into it. So our agenda for this afternoon, after I provide some updates on federal funding, we'll get right into the state's budget and the governor's recommended phased-in implementation of the People-Centered Funding Plan. And based on that, then, I will go through revenue projections, since, as we'll explain, those are even more important based on that phased-in proposal. Then Mr. Bazo will get into our expenditure projections and the development of our baseline budget for you. We will go over in item 5 a preliminary budget deficit that will be based on 3 different revenue scenarios that I'll present in item 3. So see, various ranges of that deficit. And then we will go into potential solutions or policy items that we'll be looking for direction from the board from either today or in subsequent board meetings in March or certainly afterwards as well. And then we'll wrap up with kind of next steps and where we go from here. So a quick update on federal funding. The next slide we thought would be helpful to provide to you what dollars have been authorized to date. These don't represent expenditures, but simply what either grant applications we've received or we've submitted and been authorized for, or in many cases, the amount of authorized funding from other agencies. And so as you'll remember, the CARES Act was passed last March, almost a year ago. That was the first federal stimulus act with funding for school districts. There was an ESSERS allocated piece to that, and the total receipt of monies, including what later went to charters and private schools, was $9.9 million. Our net amount for programming was $9.2 million. We also received $1.3 million of ESSERS competitive monies. We were fortunate in that the state shared some of its CARES Act money, its coronavirus relief funding, and that came to us through Assembly Bill 3 in the 2020 special session. So we received $5.5 million of that. And then, as we talked before, very graciously, the city of Reno shared $2.59 million of their CARES Act allocation. They received more than $40 million, and they helped us out tremendously with more than $2.5 million that largely went to devices for our students. And then from there, you can see, the various other pots of money of the CARES Act money we have received. Again, we've received total authorization of a little over $21 million to date from the first CARES Act legislation that was passed in March of 2020. You can see at the bottom, we were recently alerted that we have been allocated $1.19 million of what we call Gear 1 money, Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds. Those were another pot authorized in the CARES Act, aside from ESSERS money. So we just got word about that. So, a significant amount of resources here that we have at our disposal, both in fiscal year 21, the current fiscal year, and a little bit in fiscal year 22 as well. And this is all due to the good work of our grants department, Ben Hayes, Lauren Olin, Jill Murdoch, and so forth. So we're happy to report that to you. Then on the next slide, this again summarizes the second stimulus package with school district funding. Some folks are now calling it CARISA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or they often talk about it in terms of ESSERS 2 and Gear 2. Either way, this is the stimulus package that was signed into law by President Trump the last week of calendar year 20. We did get a firm number on our share of those monies recently. And as you can see, it's $34,836,233. That represents 8% or so of total ESSER 2 funds distributed to Nevada school districts. And the basis for that distribution was Title I Part A allocations. Those monies may be spent in pretty much the same way as ESSER 1, and that includes backfilling any lost revenue that we have in order to preserve positions. So that is good. And then there's Gear 2 funding that goes along with the ESSERS 2 funding. The total amount available to school districts in the state is $12 million. Talking to Ben Hayes this morning, we anticipate, based on discussions with the state, that the state's grant application period will open up in the second half of March. So that's we hope that's the case. And again, our share is just shy of $35 million, which is a significant help to us as we formulate our budget, and more importantly, formulate programming to address academic recovery and other needs of our students. And then lastly, So some of the priorities for ESSERS 2 that the leadership team so far has identified. First, we'll talk about reductions to the state's class size reduction program. That's a first priority, at least that we've tentatively identified, depending on what happens with that program through the legislative session. You've heard about the English Learners Development Site Facilitator Program that will be coming to you next meeting, and there will be decisions there, but certainly ESSERS money would be available to phase in the adoption of that Site Facilitator Program over several years. Next, we've talked about providing additional allocations to schools as another potential use of ESSER II money, along with, again, kind of helping to absorb any reductions to gifted and talented or title funded positions based on the distribution of title monies in fiscal year 22. And then after that, a number of additional school supports we would like to use those ESSER monies for, and the leadership team is meeting on a weekly basis to identify what that could look like. And again, a lot of it will depend on what we have available after considering general fund budget relief here. But again, certainly we know the importance of academic recovery, supports to teachers and students that support their school performance plans. And then going back to gear one, those dollars are pegged to be used for mental wellness and the re-engagement of students. We know how important just a number of priorities are, and our hope, again, going back to the guiding principles we talked about in January, is to minimize the use of ESSER II, or what I'll call ESSER III in the next slide. We want to minimize the use of the funding for general fund relief and want to get to a place of having a balanced budget as much as possible, recognizing we're in still a recession, and there is going to be some temporary reductions to our revenues, but minimizing general fund relief and maximizing the additional programming we need to address academic recovery and other important programs.
Madam President, can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Mark. Back on slide 6, the priorities for ESSER II, I just want to clarify, is this slide in order of priority for the district or not?
Well, these would be tentative priorities at this point. Again, it's a very iterative kind of process. And I would say, and I'm kind of deferring to Dr. McNeil here, we continue to meet. Ultimately, when we bring that ESSER II application to you, which again, the state will open up applications in March, you will see the proposed uses of that ESSER II money. So this is tentative at this point, but I'll let Dr. McNeil add any comments since I can't see her actually.
Thank you, Mr. Mathers. I'm here. Thank you very much, Vice President Cottle. Great question, and it's not in any prioritized order. Obviously, one of our biggest concerns right now is the reduction in CSR, classroom size reduction funding. So if the legislature decides not to pull that out, then we would obviously have more funds and able to do other priorities. One of the biggest concerns that we have right now is the allocations, right, and the buffer to allocations and supporting our schools with additional staff personnel. So again, it's not in any type of priority order, but these are priorities that as a leadership team, we felt that we needed to bring forward to the board.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mr. Mathers, please go ahead. I know you can't see us, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So lastly, President Biden's first stimulus plan is being called the American Rescue Plan. Again, that is being proposed for a total amount of funding of $1.9 trillion, with a little less than $130 billion for public school districts. So that, doing the math, that's roughly 10 times the $13 billion that was allocated for ESSER's allocated funding in the first CARES Act. Just very roughly, the amount of funding we would expect Washoe County School District to receive based on that would be, again, roughly $75 to $85 million. We understand in the president's proposal, 20% of that would be required to be spent on academic recovery. And so checking the news this morning, what I'm seeing is that the expectation is the House of Representatives will vote on that plan, likely a straight party vote by the end of this week. And then it would move on to the U.S. Senate, where there may in fact be, haggling, negotiations and so forth, since there is a 50-50 tie in the Senate. So, but the expectation is that it moves forward. And Speaker Pelosi had noted that her expectation is that that would be delivered to the president's desk by mid-March. So again, significant resources to help us with all of our needs as students return to school full-time, presumably. And we know some of the deficits and issues they face. So this will be incredibly helpful. Any questions on this section of the presentation?
I was just looking around, Mr. Mathers, I don't see any. Superintendent McNeil?
I was just wondering, Mark, thank you very much, President Taylor. I was just wondering, Mark, would you be able to go into the expiration dates of the federal funding? I think that's important for the public and the trustees to know when these funds would expire so we can avoid a funding cliff.
Yeah, no, great question. So CARES Act 1 and ESSER 1 had a deadline of September 30th of 2022. ESSER 2, the second stimulus package passed in the last week of December of 2020, will have an effective expiration date that we must spend funds by of September 30th of 2023. I actually have not seen, in very concrete terms, the expiration date for CARES Act 3. It would be no sooner, obviously, than September 30th, 2023, but I don't know if there'll be any consideration beyond that.
If I may, Mr. Mathers, one more time, ESSER 2 has an expiration date of which month in 2023?
September 30th, 2023. So the first quarter in fiscal year 24.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Other questions before you move forward? Okay.
I do have one.
Go ahead, Vice President Cottle?
Thank you, Madam President. Mark, assuming that our school district in Washoe gets between $75 and $85 million in the American Rescue Plan, does that change some of the possible recommendations to using some of the recovery money to help us through the fiscal year, or is it still? Are you still under the belief that we should try to use all of it in an academic recovery?
I think our position right now would be to try to maximize use of those monies for academic recovery and social and emotional learning and mental health supports and any other needs the leadership team and the Board of Trustees develops over the next several months. Again, we are concerned about a fiscal cliff, and while I think it's appropriate to use some of the funding of ESSER 2 to help the state's general fund get through what hopefully is a temporary funding reduction by the state, we just need to be mindful that if we were to, for instance, use, and I know you're not suggesting this, but if we were to use, half of ESSER 3, say 40 million to write out a budget deficit, that would potentially leave us in a tremendously difficult position 2 years from now when that is not available to us. And then we have to make some very difficult decisions. So it's a balancing act, and what probably is not on the slide and should have been is the fact that, maybe we talk about it later, that the American Rescue Plan includes significant resources to states, counties, and cities. And so the expectation would be that there were numbers published for the state of Nevada's share, skimming off what major cities and counties would receive. It's at least a couple billion of additional funding for the state. And so the hope, I think, would be that some of that also makes its way to the state budget and K through 12 funding, and perhaps that would relieve us of the need to use our ESSER CARES Act money or American Rescue money for our budget shortfalls. Time will tell. I think that'll be a major discussion of the state legislature if the American Rescue Plan passes in the timelines we've talked about. So a lot of moving parts to this, and we'll just have to see how it all kind of plays out over the next several months.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, and I would agree. The more that we can spend towards the recovery and one-time dollars, the better for our long-term fiscal health as well as our educational priorities. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Cottle. Dr. Nicolette and then Trustee Thigpen.
Thank you. And to continue that discussion, Mark,
Can you get your mic just a little bit closer, if you would, Dr. Nicolette?
thank you.
Thank you.
And to continue that discussion, Mark, in theory, or maybe application, the federal dollars are meant to be used because there are shortfalls that typically, had we not gone through the COVID situation, and we're still in it, might not have occurred. So we can assume, or should assume, that some of the dollars we currently can spend, and maybe in the future, we figure out a way to use those to shore up those gaps in planning for the future and watching, projections for the future, because we're going to have gaps. And it frightens me a little bit to think that we want to think about the next 2-3 years at any expense for our student programming. And I know nobody wants that. I guess my point is back to, these monies really are intended to fill the gaps that are here and going to be here for a while.
Well, when you say gaps, there's two kinds of gaps. There's a fiscal gap, due to revenue shortfalls, and then there's a learning gap. So I want to make sure I understand which kind of gap you mean.
I would say both, because
Yeah.
we certainly have gaps and we're anticipating academic recovery needs. And we also have gaps in how we had to spend money, how we are going to have to reinstate some of our transportation, for example, nutrition programs, housekeeping. We're going to have to fill those gaps with some of that federal dollar, in my mind. And yes, of course, we have to think of the long haul. We have to have a balanced budget, period, the end. And I guess, I'll ask the question, is it too much of a slippery slope for me to be thinking that we must use those dollars to fill both those gaps that you mentioned?
Yes, Trustee Nicolette, I would agree with your characterization. Again, we're very early in the process, but I would agree there's a balancing act here. We don't want to gut our programs because of what we hope is a temporary drop in revenues, and hurt our students accordingly. But we don't want to get on the slippery slope of, and I've talked to some fellow districts who seem to be a little bit more cavalier about using federal funding just to cover their budget shortfalls. And I wouldn't want to fall into a trap of just assuming that would be the case without giving you the analysis and options you need to make those decisions. So as things become clearer, which is going to be a theme throughout this process, as things become clearer and we see how much money the state's going to allocate to us from their stimulus dollars, and as we see kind of the decisions related to CSR and other programs and how that will play out, we will continue to apprise you of kind of where we stand in terms of our deficit or surplus, and work with you, again, identifying options that make sense for us to get through this rocky 2 years, but also make sure there's enough funding to address needs of students that are huge, as we know. All of this is to say, again, our goal at the end of this, once things become clear, is to develop for you a multi-year, a minimum 4-year plan, so that you can see how the money will be used over the next biennium to address those gaps you're talking about, but then to restore fiscal stability and sustainability, certainly in years 3 and 4 of the program.
You good, Dr. Nicolette?
Oh, yes, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Thigpen?
Thank you, Madam President. Thanks, Mark, I'm very grateful for your team for staying on top of this, of course, and for being so forward-thinking. My only question is, how is your team thinking about the funding for PPE? I saw that Dr. Fauci mentioned this week that we may, for example, have to continue wearing masks into 2022. So that to me means, well, we're still, as a school district, going to have to consider the funding for PPE. Do we think we may have to rely on some federal funds, or is it looking like we might be getting what we need from the state on those types of funding?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't mean to minimize the PPE costs we will have, because you are correct. I think our expectation is we'll still need to provide face coverings to students. We'll still need to order, much greater supplies of hand sanitizer and other PPE for our schools. We've already started to do that for the rest of the fiscal year, make additional orders based on decisions yet to come. But I do believe we're expecting that we will have those costs for fiscal year 22. The state did help us out this fiscal year with many of those items, but not all. So it's probably going to be a blend of, like this year, of state assistance, general fund absorbing some costs, and then CARES Act money covering the rest. So all three sources, my expectation, would be used going forward as well.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Trustee Thigpen. Mr. Mathers, please continue.
Okay, so that covers federal funding, and again, hopefully we'll get some good news in the next several weeks. So to start about state funding, we'll go through, again, the governor's proposal to phase in implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. There's been lots of conversations at the state level about this, and we've heard, some certainly feedback from some legislators, but at this point, we're moving forward and basing our budget and building our budget, again, based on the governor's proposal. Just to be very clear, we certainly in the business office understand the reasoning and the rationale behind that phase-in, and we're certainly not critical of it. We understand, again, that rationale, and so we'll be prepared to, again, show you how that budget will be built based on that potential phase-in that will require a bill and passage of a bill to make happen. So, Jeff? Thank you. So this comes from a handout to the Commission on School Funding. Again, just to recap the state budget, budget reductions are on the left. And so as we've mentioned already, the class size reduction program that provides funding for reductions of class sizes in grades 1 through 3, it was proposed to be cut in half to $78 million each year. That has a significant impact potentially on our staffing for grades 1 through 3 and our budget. We'll talk about that in a bit. Also reduced was Read by Grade 3. This is kind of an interesting one. Read by Grade 3 was eliminated completely in the special session last year. So we have no funding in fiscal year 21 for Read by 3. The governor's proposed to restore it to half of what it used to be. And that would mean on a statewide level, roughly $17 million a year. So we're showing that in the reduction column, just like the Department of Ed did. And then there's underperforming schools turnaround and college career readiness programs that are also reduced. Not on this chart is Assembly Bill 309, which was also reduced. I think that was just kind of an oversight. But that is also proposed to be eliminated as a funding source for base funding. Budget enhancements include 28 million or so in fiscal year 22 and 33 million in fiscal year 23. This is purportedly to cover school districts' costs for the PERS rate increase, for step increases for school district employees, for health insurance increases, and for other miscellaneous inflationary costs. But I think it's fair to question, are they really covering those costs if they're reducing somewhere else on the left side? But that's a simple summary of what was reduced versus what was added in terms of overall statewide funding of K through 12. And this is shown in the next slide as well. This is consolidation of what we showed you in January based on our analysis of the state's budget. So in the top section are what's considered kind of true base funding. The general fund basic support is what used to be funded through the distributive school account. We have the class size reduction program, which you can see has been reduced from 159 million to 77 million and change. Senate Bill 551 with some additional funding provided last session. The actual funding source for SB 551 is held up in the courts, but the state has budgeted for those monies. And then we talked about the AB 309 program. This was a consolidation of a number of former categorical grant programs that we worked with the Speaker of Assembly on, and that were basically used to support the general fund. We were given a tremendous amount of flexibility about how to spend that funding, which was great in the current biennium, but that is proposed to go away. And then underneath that are former categorical grants that are now considered part of base funding. You can see those listed. There are pretty significant operational questions associated with these former grants, and they all hinge around how much flexibility do school districts really have if they choose to not use all of the funding indicated for each of those programs. Will they still be held to the outcome measures of the grant or not? How will the state look at each of those areas in terms of how we might emphasize one versus de-emphasize another? We've been told by the Department of Ed that there is flexibility for this funding. But again, it begs the question then operationally, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the flexibility for the state's expectations for each of these programs? But we're sharing with you those statewide numbers so that you can see them. And then in total, you can see total base funding shows a decrease in fiscal year 21, again, based on state revenues suffering, and then somewhat of a rebound in 22, but still less than what was funded in 20. And then you can see in 23, there's actually a decrease in statewide base funding. This will be very familiar to those of you who've been through state budget processes before. Essentially, the state, again, is banking on local revenue growth the districts will receive to offset that reduced level of support in fiscal year 23, the second year of the biennium. Okay. This was a chart from last slide basically showing what happens in 22, 23, in each of the next 4 years of the biennium. Again, categorical funding now will be folded into weighted funding. So that was part of the pupil-centered funding plan. That will happen next biennium under the governor's proposed phase-in. What won't happen is the pooling of all local revenues with state revenues in a single state education account, the second row there. And that has huge repercussions and implications for our budget that we'll get into. The per pupil guarantee will also be eliminated in the coming biennium. We just are not completely sure whether that applies to just local revenues or also state revenues. So we'll talk about that in a second. But again, it's just to remind you about what moves forward over the next 2 years versus what is delayed until years 3 through 4.
Mark, if I may,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
this,
Yes,
this,
ma'am.
this is based upon the governor's proposal, correct? The
Yes,
proposed
ma'am.
budget? Okay, so these are the things that we're watching because we don't know what the legislature has done on these things as of yet.
That's exactly right. All of the phased in kind of ideas and concepts here will have to be written into a bill that we have yet to see, passed by the legislature and then signed by the governor. So we know, the legislature could have a different take on this and decide, well, I don't actually want this to move forward at this time, or gee, I want to accelerate, some things that weren't slated to happen on the governor's proposal, want to accelerate them to happen on July 1. So you're right, this will require a great deal of monitoring by Lindsay and us to make sure we understand what that bill actually looks like.
Thank you, Mark. Trustee Nicolette?
Thank you. Can you, Mark, by the way, you do such a wonderful job of explaining things, and so that's why I'm going to ask. The creation of state education fund and stabilization account, can you give a little descriptors of those two, the state education fund and stabilization account? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question because we don't go into that elsewhere in the presentation. Basically, under the Nevada plan, the distributive school account where school district funding is budgeted for is just that. It's an account in the general fund. And what has happened historically is when the local school support tax or property taxes or other revenues that go into the DSA are higher than budgeted, they do not stay in that account. Well, they stay in that account, but what they serve to do is reduce the state general fund's portion of funding. So if LSST and property taxes say we're 200 million more on a statewide basis than what was budgeted, the state general fund's portion of K through 12 funding was reduced by the same 200 million. That's how it works in the Nevada plan, and that's why we see the state share of K through 12 funding dropping virtually every year because local revenues have been fairly strong up to and including the pandemic. What the concept in Senate Bill 543 that creates the pupil-centered funding plan is to instead have a separate fund, a special revenue fund, such that the state's general fund commitment doesn't change and any increased revenues above and beyond what were budgeted stay in that account and stay for K through 12 and don't just serve to reduce the state general funds piece. It gets into some accounting technicalities. What the state has proposed is to create a state education account within the general fund next biennium, but to preserve funding there, to not let any money be siphoned out back to the state general fund. Then in the 23-25 biennium, they would create an actual state education fund that would be, from an accounting standpoint, more secure. The stabilization account is a concept where over time monies go into the account to help stabilize school districts funding when there is a recession. So if there's a future recession and revenues, again, because of the lack of a per pupil guarantee now, if revenues fall, school districts in theory would be able to access the stabilization account to offset that fall in revenue. There's no money funded right now in the stabilization account, so this right now is kind of more of a theoretical concept.
Thank you very
That
much.
was pretty technical, but I hope that made sense.
You did a great job. Thank you.
And thank you very much, and that was really a good explanation, so thank you for asking that question, Trustee Nicolette. Mark, I think we're ready to move forward, sir.
Okay. Again, how this is proposed to work in the phased implementation is that state revenues, which you see on the left, which include the state's general fund, marijuana taxes, portion of the slot tax, it's tax levied actually to each slot machine in Nevada, hotel taxes in Clark, and then we're going to talk about this big time in a second, out-of-state local school support taxes. All of those are pooled and flow through the new pupil-centered funding model and receive all the adjustments of that new model, and then spits out to us and each other and every other school district in the form of a per pupil number. So that gets funneled through the model and gets adjusted for, the small school equity adjustment and the cost adjustment, what we call CWI. All of those revenues flow through that. The right hand of the screen shows local revenues, which again, under the phased-in implementation proposal now, stay straight, with each district, and those do not flow through the model. They are retained by each school district. But again, the difference between the proposal and how the Nevada plan works currently is none of those revenues are guaranteed. So we're going to operate, if this proposal goes through, much like cities and counties who are going to see local revenues like property taxes or like their portion of sales taxes fluctuate up and down. So we are going to operate more like other local governments in that respect, which makes it all the more important, as the next slide kind of shows, for us to be very careful about how we budget those resources. So we're on to the next section, which is development of our revenue projections for the fiscal year 22 budget. So there are three main revenue sources now under the proposed phase-in. The first are state revenues. So again, this chart again shows all those state resources that go into now the state education account, flow through the model, and then come back to us as a per pupil number. And this is calculated by the state using the current pupil-centered funding plan model. Our share that we have in writing from the Department of Ed is $178 million or so. This again comes to us as a per pupil number. Just so you know, Washoe County's per pupil number is the lowest of any district. Sorry, Jeff, I'm trying to, can you go back? So that's the first of the three major revenue sources we have. And that just comes, this is a calculation done by the state. As our enrollment goes up and down, that number would go up and down. But that's based on their estimated enrollment times our per pupil number.
Well, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in right here. I'm sorry, Mark. We're going to jump in just because we have a couple of questions. Vice President Caldo, and then I have one myself as well.
Thank you, Madam President. Mark, if you could briefly just go over with us why in the calculations Washoe County is last in the state in state share revenue?
A lot of people have wondered this and kind of tried to figure this out and give a theoretical explanation for it. The explanation offered is that we are not so small like rural school districts to benefit from the small school district adjustment and the small district adjustment. So those entities are much smaller, much more dispersed over geography than we are, and they get a lot more adjustments. And as a result, their per pupil number can be as high as 9, 10, 11,000 per pupil because they just don't have the economies of scale we do. On the other hand, we're not as big as Clark County, who has even greater economies of scale than we do, and therefore benefits greatly from that factor. So that's kind of the narrative that has been used to explain why we're the lowest. It doesn't quite explain it. Certainly, part of the explanation is related to the cost adjustment factor, otherwise known as the comparable wage index, or CWI, that shows Washoe County having the lowest cost adjustment factor, along with several other districts in the state. If it weren't for that, I don't think we would be at the lowest. So that would be my answer to you.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. So that I'm sure that's a talking point for us with legislature, because if that gets adjusted, that helps us. And I think we all know here that Washoe County is not a cheap place to live, whereas the state calculations factors in that it's a cheap place to live. So hopefully we can get that changed in this session for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Caldo. And my question, not surprisingly, I'm sure, is really along those same lines. Would you talk a little bit about that cost adjustment factor, just into the detail of it, and and look at I guess your prospects on if there's any room to have any adjustments made to that as this goes forward.
Yes, thank you. There's been various versions of this cost adjustment factor that have been prepared by the State Department of Education's consultants. They looked at, for instance, the share of our budget that's spent on personnel costs versus non-personnel costs. They've, again, based on feedback, looked at many different versions of this, but in essence, what all those versions rely to one extent or another are analysis of wages of positions besides teachers in each county. And so their consultant purportedly looked at the wages of all accountants in Washoe versus Clark versus Carson versus Douglas versus Elko and so forth. They've used a sampling of that data from the American Community Survey that is sample data. And they have tried to perform a regression analysis on it where they try to look at how much higher or lower does an accountant of a similar demographic and similar number of years of experience make in Washoe versus Clark versus Douglas versus Carson, etc. And they take all of those professions and all of that sample data and try to come up with regression coefficients that try to tell them how much higher people may be making in Clark versus Washoe. And so, as an example, if the analysis shows, which it allegedly does, that professions make more in Clark than Washoe, that tells them that they need to offer teachers more money in Clark than Washoe to compete with those other professions. One of our concerns about this is the sample data that is being used. Another concern to some degree is the age of the data that is being used. Dr. McNeil and I had a productive conversation with the Department of Ed about revisiting the data and the decisions made by the Commission on school funding. And the Commission makes only advisory opinions, but we are hopeful to be able to come back to the Commission on school funding and revisiting this data and providing a critique for the Commission and then seeing where that goes.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to follow up, and I'm going to go to Dr. Nicolette. What support might you need from the board in that regard, if any at all, at least at this point?
I'd look to Dr. McNeil to help kind of address that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, President Taylor. I think just understanding, that question that you just put out there for the public to understand exactly what the implications are for the comparable wage index. I'm going to be cautiously optimistic that we will be able to present our data coming forward to the Commission in whether it's the March or the April meeting. So I'm hoping we have a meeting this Friday with the Nevada Department of Education and the chair of the Commission. And so I'm going to say that we're cautiously optimistic that we will be able to present that data and then just have the board's support in moving forward with that as we move forward to the Commission.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think all of us being aware of it is certainly an important big step, and as we're having conversations in the community and so on, at least it gives us that kind of background. So I appreciate that. Dr. Nicolette?
Yes, thank you. So does the NDE consultants, do they overlay the comparable wage adjustment onto the comparable cost of living in an area, or do they just look at wage adjustment?
In the current calculation, it's both. I'm going by memory, but I think roughly 78% is a cost of wage adjustment and 22% is a cost of living adjustment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can go ahead and continue, Mark. Thank you for that.
Okay. So the second major bundle of revenues that we have to estimate for the preparation of the fiscal year 20 budget are what we call major local revenues. And again, in the Nevada plan, there's a per pupil support guarantee, so that if local school support taxes fall, the distributive school account makes it up. If local school support taxes are higher than budgeted, which has kind of been the norm lately until the pandemic, the amount of funding from the distributed school account falls. So you end up basically where you budgeted. That's under the Nevada plan. Going forward, again, our local revenues are not guaranteed, so there will not be any offset or adjustment provided by the distributed school account if revenues fall below budget, or if they rise above budget, we get to keep those monies. So it's incredibly important that we look at these revenues carefully and budget them and estimate them carefully, because if we overestimate these revenues and they don't materialize in fiscal year 22, we have to make up for it either by accessing our fund balance, which we never want to do, or making mid-year cuts, which we never want to do, or otherwise finding a way to fill that gap. So again, we're kind of more like cities and counties at this point in being very careful in those revenue estimates. Unfortunately, unlike cities and counties, we're even less diversified in our revenue sources than they are. So we've got to get this right.
I would also just ask, thank you, Mr. Mather. And likewise, if the local revenues exceed projections, then it's incumbent upon us as a board to make wise decisions to make sure that we have some coverage, so to speak, if darker days are ahead unexpectedly or otherwise. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's keep going.
Okay. So the next slide shows you our major local revenues and where they stand so far in fiscal year 21. Property taxes is our largest revenue source. We are seeing very good growth there. 3 out of the 4 installments for secured property taxes have been paid. The last one will be paid next month. But so far, with 3 of those 4 installments in, revenues are 6% higher than the prior fiscal year. And that's right in line with what the county treasurer and the state had estimated. Our local school support tax, which is the 2.6% rate on sales taxes, in Washoe, our total rate is 8.265%, I believe. Of that, 2.6% is collected for the LSST. We are down 1% compared to last year. And I know some of you may be saying, what the heck, Mark? You've been telling us WC1 sales taxes are up 5%. So how could LSST be down 1%? And you would be right to point that out to me, and we're going to explain why in the next 3 slides. But we are actually down in terms of our LSST compared to fiscal year 20. And then government services tax is the third major revenue source. We call it GST. It's part of the motor vehicle fees you pay annually on a cash basis with 6 months posted. Those revenues are up 5.8%. So people are back to buying vehicles, visiting dealerships or buying them private party or what have you. So that's good to see. Then the last line are other local revenues. They're not a lot, but those are comprised of things like rental income. And so we've stopped renting out our schools to community groups and churches and so forth. So we've seen basically 0 revenues there. This would include things like transportation field trip fees. Obviously, we haven't had athletics, so that's a big 0 there in terms of that revenue. There's a mix of other revenues. Investment earnings have declined due to the Fed's monetary policy. So we're down a little bit more than $2 million compared to last year. That is expected. We knew that was going to happen this fiscal year. So it's not an unexpected number. So overall, our revenues are up just 1.2% through the month of January. So that gives you some sense of where we stand today. So the next slides will again kind of go into local school support tax. So this graph shows you historically how that revenue has trended. And prior to the pandemic, we averaged roughly 6% per year growth of that revenue source. Then with the pandemic, for the months of March, April, and May of 20, we saw declines in that sales tax money of 16%, which is better than what a lot of us feared. But it dived 16% from March through May of last year. And then in June, we started seeing sales tax revenues pick up and come off the floor from minus 16%. However, from that period of June 2020 through November of 2020, and that's what we have numbers posted for by the state, we are still down a little less than 1%. That's minus 0.7%. So we still haven't returned to where we were in last fiscal year. Next slide, Jeff. So again, wait a minute, Mark, you've been telling us WC1's been doing really well, and it has. And the difference is that our share of LSST does not include out-of-state sales. Out-of-state sales taxes for local school support tax go to the distributive school account. And that's just the way it's been forever. And it really didn't matter too much under the Nevada plan since they all flowed through and came out in terms of our per pupil number. But it matters now because we're not going to receive that portion of LSST in our treasury. And so so the blue line is, again, our share of LSST, which really are in-state sales taxes collected in Washoe County as Washoe County residents spent. The red line are statewide out-of-state LSST revenues. So taxation can't break out what out-of-state sales taxes generated just in Washoe are. So I'm just showing you on a statewide basis how those revenues are performed. And you can see beginning in fiscal year 19, with the Market Facilitators Act and some Supreme Court rulings, Nevada started collecting a lot of these out-of-state sales tax that it hadn't before. And you can see the growth in that revenue, 21% versus LSST revenues in Washoe, which was still a healthy 9%, but still there's a big difference there. And then in fiscal year 20, there's even a bigger variance. We only received our share of LSST grew 4.7% for the first 9 months of fiscal year 20, still not bad. But out-of-state sales tax revenues that are captured in the LSST grew 40%. Then during the 3-month pandemic period, again, our LSST portion fell 16%. And actually out-of-state sales taxes didn't change a bit from the prior from March through May of 2019. And then since then, with what I call recovery, out-of-state sales taxes collected on a statewide basis have grown 27%, whereas we're down 0.7% from the period of June through November. So I don't mean to be so technical, but this is the reason why our sales taxes haven't recovered. And I'll compare and contrast that with Washoe County's consolidated tax growth. They're up, I believe, 9% fiscal year to date. We're down 1%. This is the reason, because as consumers' spending habits have changed, and they can't go to restaurants, for instance, to spend as much as they used to, and brick and mortar store sales have declined. People have shifted their spending habits. They're saving more, yes, but even more than that, they are going online and buying goods online, and many of those online vendors are out of state. And that sliver of the LSST revenues that are due to out-of-state vendors go to the state. They don't come to us. They're not included in the LSST revenues we receive. So the next slide
Excuse me.
again shows that in a
I'm
different
sorry,
way.
Mark, we're gonna jump in. Dr. Nicolette?
I'm sorry, Mark, that was a wonderful explanation. Two things around that out of state. I find it hard to believe that in this day and age, the state of Nevada can't figure out those tax dollars that are being spent from online industry, that they can't figure out that they're Washoe counties or any other county, and that they should come to us. I guess my question is there any discussion in the pupil-centered funding plan to figure out how those out-of-state dollars, how they can belong to each county, or is there some way to distribute them so that the state's not keeping it all, which I don't think that we, the state, should do that. They should be dispersed to the counties.
That could certainly be an amendment to the bill to phase in implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, but that's how the law works currently, and I'm sure taxation could break that data out. We asked them last month or maybe 3 weeks ago, and it's just, I think it's more of a timing issue for them. But that certainly could be a change we look at. Candidly, I don't think many of my peers or even Department of Ed have zeroed in on this issue very much. So we'll need, there needs to be some education, no pun intended, on this issue.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, when I buy something from ABC store that's in Georgia and online, and I pay a tax on it, that tax money is going directly into our state of Nevada coffers.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the WC1 tax rate is 0.54%. We get the 0.54% of that sales tax of the purchase you spent. That does come to Washoe County. But the 2.6% of the 8.265% sales tax rate, that goes to Nevada. So LSST, to my knowledge, is the only one that has this split, where out-of-state sales taxes for that portion of the overall aggregate sales tax goes to the state, and only in-state sales go to each school district. Every other type of sales tax, like WC1 you see here, or even the 2% sales tax that goes to the state, that's going to be included in Washoe, in what's reported for Washoe County. It's just LSST is not.
Thank you.
It's all collected, but LSST is distributed differently than every other type of sales tax.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Maverick. Please go ahead and continue.
Okay, so this slide just, again, shows you the differences in growth between WC1, that's in red, our LSST, which is down 1%, and then the purple is on a statewide basis, out-of-state sales taxes. So you can see, just again, consumers are spending more online. That shouldn't probably be a surprise to anybody. They can't spend locally as much as they used to. Going forward, as we'll talk about in the next slide, that's the big question. Will consumers' spending habits revert when, the economy normalizes based on some normalization of COVID? That's the big question. So on the next slide, we go into that. Oh, yes. So starting to wrap up our revenue projections now, we've provided 3 scenarios for the board and for ourselves as we model what could happen in fiscal year 22. And ultimately, we'll need to winnow this down to one scenario because our budget has to be based on one scenario. But we wanted to kind of be very transparent with you and the public about what could happen in fiscal year 22. So we have a conservative scenario, a return to normalcy, where life looks like very much like what it did pre-pandemic. And then between those two, a mid-range scenario. So for property taxes, the conservative scenario assumes 2% growth, mid-range 4%, and then a return to normalcy 5%. To be candid, I think 2% growth probably is too conservative, so we probably wouldn't use that ultimately. But the residential property tax cap is 3%, and then there's depreciation added on top of that. So we kind of start with a floor of 2%, but it's likely we'll have continued new development and so forth. So this gives you a range of property tax revenue estimates all the way from 127.43 million for the conservative scenario to 131 million, the return to normalcy scenario. Not a lot of dispersion between those two numbers, right? So we will see what the state's official property tax estimate is March 25th. That is based on data from the county assessor and county treasurer. I have a lot of confidence in that number. We'll ultimately use that number. It's probably going to be closer to the mid-range or return to the normalcy number. So that's good news. But we wanted, again, show you the range we think each revenue could fall between. Local school support tax is the big one in terms of the degree of change between conservative and return to normalcy. So for the conservative scenario, we've assumed for the remaining 7 months of the fiscal year for revenues where revenues have not posted, a continuation of the minus 1.1% situation we have today, and then no growth in fiscal year 22. Again, conservative, but there's nothing that necessitates local school support tax from being any higher than that, really. I mean, there's, the mid-range scenario assumes growth this fiscal year for the remainder of this fiscal year, 1.7%. That could happen. December hasn't posted. December is a huge revenue month, so we'll see once that's posted how that comes out. But again, if people go online and are buying from retailers located out of the state, we may still not see growth. But the mid-range scenario assumes 1.7% growth this fiscal year compared to fiscal year 20, then 2.5% growth in fiscal year 22 as restaurants start to reopen and people start to be comfortable about going back to restaurants or brick and mortar stores and pivot away from online purchases. And then the return to normalcy scenario, like I say, is more of, okay, beginning in July, people are comfortable doing what they used to do pre-pandemic, and so it assumes growth in fiscal year 22 of 5%, which could happen. But you can see the difference then in the revenue estimates between conservative and the most optimistic scenario here. It could be anywhere from 203 million to 219 million, $16 million difference. So obviously this requires great analysis. As months roll in, we'll see the trajectory of those revenues this fiscal year, and then we can come back to you with greater analysis. And then GST, you can see the estimates there, from conservative to most optimistic. Again, I think mid-range is probably most realistic, but the return to normalcy here could happen. We've seen government services tax revenue increases of double digits in prior years. So that one, we'll again have to look at each month and how people are spending in terms of car purchases and so forth. Lastly, I included franchise tax, which NDE considers a major revenue source, but kind of isn't, but don't expect much change there. So I'll stop in case there are questions. I know it's a lot of numbers on a page, but we wanted to be really transparent with you about our assumptions.
As of right now, Mr. Mather, I don't see any lights on. I do want, just want to show appreciation for the three options, conservative and more moderate, and then a little more enthusiastic, let's just say. enthusiastic, but I do appreciate the look and then really the dialogue around why those projections landed where they were, where they did in terms of the goals and the percentage growth, and really in your honest outlook on, you know, we obviously, we all know we can't predict the future, but just your honest outlook based upon your experience on, hey, this tax has grown this much and it could happen, but here are some things to take a look at. So I certainly appreciate that as we make these really hard decisions. These are difficult budget decisions on any regular year, but especially this year with all of the unknowns in the obviously the funding formula change, in addition to potential for outside revenue that could help. But, you know, as we've been talking about, we want to be wise and not budget any outside additional revenues from CARES funding or relief fundings or anything like that. Those are still one-time expenditures, but they can certainly help as we need to prop some things up. So just a lot of different things to, this is my third time around on this, just a lot of different things to consider.
Yeah, for sure. Just to hit the point home even more. So if we were to budget for that return to normalcy scenario for local school support tax, it budgeted 219 million, but what came in was more closer to the mid-range scenario, 214. Obviously, then that's a $5 million hole in our budget. So, you know, those are kind of the risks of getting too far out of over your skis, if you will, and trying to be as accurate as you can with that crystal ball.
President Taylor?
Yes.
I do have a question.
Dr. McNeil, Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you. Just a curious question on the local revenues in those 4 categories. Is there, can you make any best guesses if something's happening in property taxes, you can assume something in LSST, government services, et cetera, or are they so totally separate and not intertwined at all that you can't make assumptions from one to the other?
Yeah, they're really so distinct that they can go in different paths, unless it's an event like the Great Recession, where they're all going to fall precipitously and the correlations are strong. But other than a really strong snap down or maybe snap up, they're not terribly correlated. Property taxes are based on largely assessed valuation, which has its own complicated formula, but it's more recession resistant for sure. And so as we see housing prices go up, that affects the land portion of your assessed value, not your property portion, not your building improvements portion, but it does affect the land value. And then we, you know, of course, we've had new development to some degree that helps. We've talked about the vagaries of LSST and how it's even more complicated to look at than just thinking about retail sales in general. And then GST historically seems to be the highest revenue growth that there is, which isn't the way the formula should work, but people, at least in this region, like to buy new cars. And so their taxes shoot up based on the MSRP of the car, the new car they bought versus the depreciated value of the car they sold. So unfortunately, they're not highly correlated, and you've got to look at each one separately.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Mather, I think that's all on this. We can jump into other local revenues.
Okay, yep, yes, ma'am. Next slide. So again, we talked about these other local revenues, and by and large, what we would assume here is some return to normalcy, that we would assume that school athletic programs would be in full swing next fiscal year, that we would be up for renting facilities with hopefully some phase down of COVID concerns and risks. Certainly we look at these revenues on a line-by-line basis, and if things change to those assumptions, we'd make adjustments accordingly. But again, they don't amount to a tremendous amount of money, $6 million or so. But we do look at those individually and look at trend analysis when we develop our revenue projections. And I didn't go into any of those really, but again, they would return by and large to fiscal year 20 revenue levels, with the exception of investment earnings. So that's one side of the ledger, the revenue side, and how we build our budget. The next side of the ledger, the expenditure side, Mr. Bazo is going to present on so that I can get a drink or what have you, and he'll take it from here.
Thanks, Mark. So on the expenditure side of the ledger, we'll start going over those projections. But before we get into the numbers, what I'd like to do is explain what goes into those baseline projections. So it does include the existing levels of staffing, and then we adjusted allocations for schools based on enrollment changes we saw in the fall, which was a decrease in enrollment. Then we adjust for known salary and benefit increases. So employee step increases, we know that there's a PERS rate increase. And then any known contract increases or other inflationary adjustments for our non-personnel expenses. What this estimate you're about to see does not include, it does not include assumptions about reductions to formerly grant-funded staff. There's no assumptions about shifting costs to federal stimulus money, even though that's allowed. And then there's also no assumptions about future salary adjustments that are subject to negotiations with our collective bargaining units. So going into some of the numbers, what I'd like to do is start us off with where we started FY21, so the current fiscal year, where we ended up after our mid-year adjustments, and then from there, that was the baseline of our FY22 budget, and then I'll walk you through the FY22 numbers. So if you recall, back in September, we had a significant enrollment decrease, so we had some budget adjustments due to those. So as you can see here, we estimated about $2.5 million in turnover savings. So, you know, employees that retire or leave the district for other reasons, they're usually at higher salaries. They get replaced with employees at lower salaries, so we see a savings there. Now the next row, read by 3 teachers. When that funding was cut during the special session, those teachers were overaged into general fund positions. They were more experienced teachers, and so we saw an increase in the cost for teachers in the general fund of about $1 million. Some other changes we made, we had 12 teacher allocations in our allocation bank. We deleted those, and that was a savings of about $880,000. And then we had 19 vacant teacher allocations that we were able to reduce in the amount of $1.41 million. One item we had in the FY21 budget was we projected a 5% health insurance rate increase. Well, due to the good performance of the health insurance fund, there's a variety of reasons why that fund was performing well. We didn't have to increase rates in FY21, so we had a savings of $1.27 million there. For our other post-employment benefits rate, we decided not to fund that rate in FY21. That's a one-time savings of $1.89 million. Then with the increase of students at North Star, we saw an increase in the cost with the contract for Pearson, which is the online module that school uses, of about $230,000. And reviewing our operating budgets, we have chargeback budgets for internal services for the departments, and that was a savings of about $1.5 million. We saw a significant decrease in our Medicaid fund revenue, so we added a $1.5 million transfer to the Medicaid fund from the general fund. And then we had one-time COVID costs in the amount of about $500,000, so that included some on-call positions, additional hours for certain positions, a distance and blended learning director, which is actually an ongoing cost. We'll get to the next slide, and other one-time costs. So that got us to our base of $490 million in the general fund. So moving into the next slide, as you can see, our starting point here for the FY22 general fund budget adjustments is that $490 million from the prior slide. So getting to the FY22 budget adjustments, the first row here is adding back that one-time savings for OPEB. So we needed to add that back in. The next row is backing out those one-time COVID costs with the exception of the director of distance and blended learning. We then added hotspots for student devices, in case we need to continue to provide connectivity to our students in FY22. In reviewing our turnover savings, we had estimated $2.5 million in turnover savings at the beginning of the year, but after further analysis, we saw there was about another $770,000 in turnover savings. Then our employee step increases were $10.14 million. That's a cost we see on an annual basis. This row for other contractual increases was $3 million. So if you recall, during FY21, the Washoe Education Association had, in the prior negotiation, negotiated a 1% COLA based on fund balance. That's an ongoing cost, so we had to add that into this estimate. The PERS rate change, that'll be about $480,000. We're projecting a life insurance rate increase as well of about $70,000. We have about 3 general fund positions that were slated to end on June 30th. So we backed those out of the budget. That's a savings of $340,000. And then in September, we used other maneuvers to make sure that we kept as many allocations of schools as possible so that we could ensure that we were able to keep schools open. Moving into FY22, we reset school allocations to enrollment. In the prior presentation, we had gone over our assumptions that things return to, at least social distancing requirements are no longer, so that we can go back to our normal allocation guidelines. So by doing that, that was a savings of about $4.4 million. And then this line for new school operating costs, those are the costs for the principal, other office staff, custodial site facility staff, and utilities and maintenance costs for the new Inskeep Elementary School in Cold Springs. And then the next row here is the enrollment contract to try to bring students into our district. That comes at a cost of about $170,000. The next row, athletics transportation, again, assuming things go back to normal and sports are on the normal track, we've seen an increase in prior years of the cost for athletic transportation, so we're accounting for that here. And then as we mentioned in our last presentation and reviewing the property and liability insurance fund, we were gonna probably need general fund support in FY22, and that's the case, and that amount is about $1.2 million. We had other miscellaneous budget adjustments that rounded out to about $20,000. And then this last item here, with the end of many categorical grants, including the Zoom categorical grant, that categorical grant goes away, and that the funding for Zoom is now shifted to the EL or English Learner weighted funding category. So our assumption here is that we're shifting EL costs from the general fund over to that EL weight. So the net budget adjustments for FY22, or net cost increases, are $2.19 million for a total general fund estimated cost of $492.19 million. Are there any questions so far to hear?
Looks like we're good, Jeff.
Trustee Church has a couple questions or comments.
Okay, please, go right ahead.
Number one, just for the record, I read that CASIA enrollment contract. That's a worst case scenario, or arguably a best case scenario, the 170, because we would make it up in state reimbursement. But I don't think there's any way we're going to actually end up spending that. So am I correct on that?
Correct on not spending the full 170,000?
Yeah, because that's based on them recruiting tons of students back into the program.
Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe that's 300 students for the 170,000? Or was it more than that? I don't
No,
know.
I think it's actually only 200 students.
200? Okay.
Yeah.
So we could spend the full $170,000 if all 200 are brought in.
Okay, so it's a variable. And then more or less a comment on PERS. When you read the PERS website, they're wonderful, they're stable, everything's coming up roses. And the answer is simple. They simply raise our PERS rates every year. When I started, it was like 17%. Now it's, I think, 40.5 or 41%. So in other words, for every $100,000, say a police officer makes, the school district has to pay in $41,000 a year. So yeah, PERS is wonderful. They're never going to go bankrupt. I guess my comment is that maybe we should start having Lindsay or somebody showing up at these PERS meetings saying, hey, give us a break. You got to cut the PERS payouts or increases or something, but you've got to do something to help us. Thoughts on that?
I'll jump in. So I had to chuckle, Trustee Church. You're right. It's easy to say everything's well when you get to charge other people, other entities a higher and higher rate every year. The rates that we have to pay are just based on an actuarial calculation of the present value of future benefits versus the present value of contributions by member agencies. And so they really don't have any flexibility to lower rates because that would mean increasing their unfunded liability. And so they're held to actuarial standards and accounting standards in calculating the rate. Really the only relief that we would have, and this has happened, right, is that the state going on a go-forward basis can choose to modify and decrease benefits for new employees and create a new tier of PERS benefits for new employees, which they've done 2 or 3 times, which clearly are not offsetting kind of demographic assumption changes the actuary is making that show an increased cost. So that's really, you have to modify the plan and plan benefits going forward to make any dent in contribution rates.
I think I'm hearing, other than maybe a legislative approach, PERS can't say, Sergeant Church, you guys don't get your 4% pay raise this year. You don't get whatever. We're not going to give you 1 year of a pay raise.
Right.
Stop giving me money. They can't do that.
Nope, that's correct.
My perspective, I guess that's good, but not from the school district. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
I'm sorry, Trustee Church, were there more questions? I want to make sure
No, I have a whole bunch at the end when they're done, but nothing on this slide.
at this point, so, okay, please go ahead, Jeff, please continue.
Okay. So moving into this next slide here, this is going to show us our total base and special ed funding. So we went over the general fund cost of the $492.19 million. We also have class size reduction that gets placed into base funding under the partially implemented pupil-centered funding plan. So we need to include those costs of $19.9 million. And then we have other categorical programs, which we'll hit on another slide here in a few moments, of former categorical grants that are now placed in base funding. So the assumption here is that those categorical grants and the cost of $10.66 million, we would continue to do that or continue to fund those programs. and that brings us to a total cost of $522.75 million. And then we also need to add in our state special education funding cost of $32.57 million. That brings our total base and special ed funding amount to $555 million.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
So now we'll go over the estimated FY22 preliminary budget deficit. So this slide here will show us the conservative, mid-range, and return to normalcy scenarios that Mark went over from the revenue projections a few minutes ago. And again, this is under the partial implementation of the People-Centered Funding Plan. So if we go over this conservative scenario first, the state funding, that's the number provided by NDE that Mark went over in slide 14, the $178.18 million. Our charter schools in the Washoe County School, or in Washoe County, also get a portion of our local revenues. So we're accounting for that here, and that'll be over $32 million in this scenario. Another thing we needed to adjust for on the state revenue side was they used an enrollment number about 1,000 students higher than our flat enrollment of 61,673 students from earlier this year. They anticipate making an enrollment adjustment in April, and so we're getting ahead of that, and we think we'll see a decrease of about $1.89 million because of that adjustment to our actual average daily enrollment. So that brings total state funding to $143.9 million. Our major local revenues, again in the three scenarios Mark went over in the earlier slide, it's $351 million here. And then our miscellaneous local revenues were the roughly $6 million. And then the special education portion of $32.57 million. So our total sources in the conservative scenario are $533.75 million. The total uses from the prior slide of $555 million brings us to an estimated deficit of $21.58 million in the conservative scenario. And then if we, considering the revenue scenarios we went over in the mid-range scenario and the return to normalcy scenario, we could have a projected deficit of $7.9 million in the mid-range scenario, or just over $1.5 million in the return to normalcy scenario. So there's a wide range there, but again, we could have fluctuations in those local revenues. Are there any questions at this slide?
We do have one. Jeff, we'll go to Trustee Nicolette.
Okay, Jeff, be patient with me, please, because, all right, back to the pupil-centered funding plan, and I know it's in ages and stages kind of scenario, but when I look at this slide, the FY22 estimated general fund deficit, I see special education. We have planned for that infusion. What about the other two categories of at-risk and EL? Or is special ed at risk, and what I'm missing is English language learners and gifted and talented? Because are there not 3 categories in that per pupil funding plan? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Trustee Nicolette. So yes, there are separate weighted funding categories for gifted and talented English learners and at risk. The reason we have special education shown here is because anything above this $32.57 million that the state funds separately for special education, the general fund transfers the remaining amount needed for special education over to the special education fund. So that general fund, I'm going to go back a slide real quick. That general fund transfer to special ed is included in this $492 million figure here. So this is just the straight impacts to the general fund. We're not looking at the weighted funding categories for gifted and talented, EL, and at-risk at this time, or on these particular slides.
Thank you. That really helped me a lot. And I guess here again's the crystal ball. When might you feel comfortable providing us with those other two weighted categories?
We'll have more information on those during the March budget work session for the tentative budget. We had a slide in here earlier that assumes that we will be shifting general fund costs for EL, or a portion of them, over to the EL weighted funding category. But we can come back for the March workshop with slides like this for those weighted funding categories as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Looks like Trustee Church has a question.
Trustee Church, you must see his hand up on Zoom. Great. Trustee Church?
Thank you very much. I do have a question. Is now a bad time or a good time to mention the $20 million Incline Village lawsuit that would presumably be added to those figures?
Well, I think
It's never a good time to talk about Incline Village.
I guess I would look to Mr. Mather to talk about where that might fit, or should that, or just what our philosophy is on that, since there is we still don't quite know where that's landing right now.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. So this shows our budget, and these are, again, ongoing revenues and ongoing costs. And just to remind the trustees, we have filed court action, and despite the Board of County Commissioners vote today, the matter is not settled. Or at least that's not how I would characterize it. But if we exhausted and lost all of our legal avenues, to address this issue, and if we were responsible for the entire $20 million liability, that's not an ongoing cost, right? It certainly has to be factored in to these revenue estimates, because as you know, the county treasurer, if the county was given the go-ahead by the court, would start reducing our property tax revenues, which certainly would affect that revenue source. So that, we might plan for that over 2 fiscal years, and that will impact these deficits, therefore, accordingly. So we can provide those numbers to you in another scenario. We weren't sure how things might play out today, and we didn't want to jump the gun in terms of showing that to you, but it certainly, that again, will affect ongoing revenues, at least the way the county has proposed it currently. And the county, or we can also choose to use fund balance, and I say we, the Board of Trustees, could also choose to use some fund balance to soften that blow. But I think it would make sense to give you that scenario in the next budget presentation on March 30th.
Trustee Church?
Just for the record, they did vote today to proceed with that withdrawal or holding back those taxes from us, and there was some discussion of further discussion.
Thank you for that, Trustee Church. Any other questions from you, Trustee Church? I can't see you, but I give you this chance, so I know you have the floor. At least at this point. You may have others at the end, I'm sure, because you mentioned that you did. But at this point, any other questions? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, Jeff, let's go ahead.
So moving into the next slide here, we did want to show what the estimated deficit looks like under the full implementation of the people-centered funding plan, because that's what's in the law, and we're supposed to have a full implementation of this on July 1st, unless there's a legislative change to proceed with the governor's proposed phased-in plan. So under this projection of the full implementation of the people-centered funding plan. As you can see, those major local revenues are no longer included in there because those all go up into state funding or go to the state and then are redistributed back through the people-centered funding plan as state funding, and that's $468.6 million. Our miscellaneous local revenues are about $6 million. And then, this is under the hold harmless to FY20 revenues scenario. And so in this scenario, the full transfer to special ed and the state special education amount are included in the same row. And that's $78.6 million for total sources of $553.19 million. Again, our total uses that we went over in previous slides are still the $555.32 million, and that gives us an estimated deficit of just over $2 million, again, under the full implementation of the people-centered funding plan.
Any questions for Jeff? Yes, I do see Vice President Cottle.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Jeff. So on this slide, with the full implementation, how does this compare to the partial implementation where you have conservative, mid-range, return to normalcy? Are there really not a wide range of estimates for full implementation? If you could just explain that, that'd be helpful.
Yes, thank you for your question, Vice President Kyle. So these are those scenarios under partial implementation. Those are different because we'll have different local revenue scenarios, right? Under the full implementation of the people-centered funding plan, up until we saw the governor's proposal of the phased-in plan, what we had was a held harmless number from FY20 revenues, and that's what we would be held harmless at under the full implementation of the people-centered funding plan. So that's that number here, is we're held harmless at FY20 revenues.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm assuming then that the full implementation, this deficit of 2.1 million, is considering that the CWI is not favorable to us, whereas if that was changed in the legislature, then our situation could look better in the short term and possibly long term. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Well, let me jump in a little bit. When we've modeled changes to the CWI under certain scenarios, we're still in a hold harmless situation, at least for fiscal year 22. So we're just in a much less, the gap between where we're funded and where we would be funded under full implementation is much, much less. So there's a lot that still has to play out. But unfortunately, at least based on the last model we saw, we'd still be in hold harmless, even with setting every district at a CWI of 1.0. I think that's about all we can say at this point. If it flip-flopped and we had the highest CWI, we haven't done that analysis, so I hope that partially answers the question.
No, I appreciate that, and I know in a future meeting when you present us with a 4-year plan, it'll be easier for us to essentially see what a hold harmless does in the long term. So, but I appreciate this information now as we have it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I know we're next to begin to look at potential solutions and some of the items that we know are still out there. Some of those should be familiar to all of us. So why don't we take just a 10-minute break between now and then? It's kind of a good, not midway point, but at least a kind of a shift, a pivot, if we will. So let's take 10 minutes and come back at a little bit after 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone. We're in recess. Of a backlog, but we are ready to go, and we will turn it back over to you, Jeff, to keep us going as we look forward potential solutions.
Thank you. One moment while I share my screen again. Okay, so for potential solutions and items to be addressed, during the last budget presentation, we informed you all that we've been working with departments doing a line-by-line review of their budgets. We still have a couple more departments that we need to complete those with, but so far we've identified $531,000 in historical savings that we can reduce as part of the FY22 budget. And the detail for those changes or line item changes were included in the attachment B for this presentation. Also, department reorganizations and vacancy reviews. Staff is still working through those and reviewing them, and we'll come back with both of those at the March work session. So, as Mark had mentioned earlier in the presentation, on the revenue side, on the statewide budget, class size reduction was cut by more than half. So here you can see it was cut by 81.82 million from FY21 to FY22 in the governor's proposed budget. So if we were to make a policy decision to reduce RCSR funding by just over half as well, this little table here shows what the impact of that would be. We currently have 227 class size reduction teachers funded specifically by that award. If we reduce that in half, that would result in a change of 113 FTE, or a reduction in those, and then the average class size in grades 1, 2, and 3 would increase by 3. Now, even though the class size reduction funding has been reduced by half in the governor's budget, the state has indicated that districts may ask for a class size reduction waiver if we fail to meet class size requirements in grades 1, 2, and 3, which we have waivers for specific grades at specific schools. We've been doing that for years, but overall as a district in grades 1, 2, and 3, we've met our requirements in the average class size for those grades. Moving on to another area, gifted and talented programming. So you were all presented some potential programming changes to gifted and talented on January 26th. Under that, there'll be a new recommendation coming to you on the 9th. But under the original plan, there's a estimated general fund savings of $2.7 million. And the general fund would still fund about $2 million of gifted and talented funding. Then going on to Zoom and English learners, this is something I talked about on the expense side of the presentation. So the Zoom categorical grant ends under the people-centered funding plan and the phased-in approach as well. And then that Zoom allocation is shifted to the EL-weighted funding. So that resulted, or in our estimate, it resulted in about $10.45 million of EL costs being shifted from the general fund to this EL weight. And then there would still be about $2.75 million of general fund support for EL programming. And this is before considering any of the changes that were proposed on February 9th about EL. And again, a new recommendation for EL programming changes will be coming to you on March 9th. We also, with the Zoom grant ending, there's 4 EL teachers funded by Zoom, so we assume those positions would also be shifted to the EL-weighted funding and continue. So these other program issues here, these are the governor's recommended budget shifts from former categorical grants to base funding. And if you recall on an earlier slide, that was about $10.6 million in total for these grants here, or former grants that now go to base funding. We're under the impression we will have some flexibility, but to what extent we're still unsure. So I think the next slide wraps up or summarizes all these changes. So here, these are policy decisions with budgetary impacts that could result in cost reductions or a shift to stimulus funding. So with class size reduction, the state has proposed reduced funding for this program. Do we follow suit by cutting the positions in half? We also have the option of moving those half of the teachers over to our ESSER 2 funds. Then again, the GATE programming changes, the estimate of those proposed changes was $2.7 million. The EL proposed programming changes, that's about $490,000 or about 7 teachers. And then read by grade 3. So the legislature deleted this program during the 2020 special session, but it's being restored at half the FY20 rate and then is included in base funding. So here's a decision of if we have that flexibility, do we choose to restore the program? And that would be $2.5 million in read by grade 3, or do we decide to use that funding to cover the budget deficit or other grant programs like Zoom that may have ended? And then same thing with those other former categorical grants from the prior slide. Do we use that to help fund our budget deficit or help offset the deficit? And then we talked about Zoom positions as well. And with that categorical grant going away, there's several positions and programs that are in the Zoom grant. So we have pre-K, our reading program, middle school class size reduction, and some technology and other professional learning costs. So one decision we would have to make, and staff is going to analyze this and come back with a recommendation at the March work session. But which of these programs, if we can keep them and fit them into either ESSERS 2, or if we choose to not do other former categorical grant programs or scale them back to help take on these positions, we'll come back with a proposal on what should be included and based on which programs we find the most effective. Did anyone have any questions on these policy decisions regarding?
Oh, we do, Jeff, thank you. I see Trustee Thigpen and then Vice President Cottle.
He was first.
I'm sorry, Vice President Cottle, then Trustee Thigpen, then Trustee Nicolette.
Okay. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Jeff. I just want to get clarification on slide 32 when we're talking about allocations with about 113. Are those cuts? And just flat out cuts in allocations? Is that overaging in other positions? I just want to make sure we understand what that would entail.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Trustee Kyle. So what we're showing there is if we were to follow suit and reduce CSR programming in half, that would be a reduction of 113 positions. However, if we were to shift those over to ESSER funding, as noted in that slide or in another slide, then we would still have those 113 positions.
Okay, thank you. I know we're not making that decision today, but that's a lot of positions. And so I think that's something as a board we have to really take in consideration if that's a direction we go, but that's a lot. I'm assuming there isn't enough in the overage to absorb that, so we just have to keep that in mind. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Vice President Cottle. One of the things that I would think that we would look at as a board is do we shift that to ESSER funding so that we aren't losing that 113, because you're absolutely right. That's, I think, way more positions than any of us would be comfortable with. But that other option would be there, so that leaves it open. And so thank you for pointing that out to us, Jeff. Trustee Thigpen, then Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you, Madam President. I do have a question on the anti-bullying grants, and I know early in the presentation it was outlined that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like the state overall puts aside $45,000 for this program. What what funds does Washoe County School District receive? And, I'm worried about this type of program being cut because of folks' mental health when they come back to our schools, and just want to make sure our kids are well taken care of. Could we possibly look at partnering with some nonprofits that might be able to help us if we have to, do something in this arena? Any information I'd appreciate. Thank you.
So my recollection on how much we received from the statewide $45,000, I think it was about $9,900 is what we received in FY20, but that was reduced during the special session this summer for the current fiscal year.
Thank you, Jeff. Trustee Thigpen?
Madam
You good
President?
on that? Are you good, Trustee Thigpen? Okay, Dr. Nicolette, and then Trustee Calvert?
Thank you. On slide 36, the whole read by grade 3, I don't want to assume anything, so do we have latitude in how we use that pot of money?
Thank you for your question, Trustee Nicolette. So, what NDE has indicated so far is that we should have flexibility in those funds, or how those funds are used now that they're in base funding. But to what extent we have flexibility, I think we still need more information on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Mathers, you wanted to chime in on that one, sir?
Yeah, just overall, I guess, and maybe this is where Dr. McNeil was going. What we're pointing out here are policy decisions. The leadership team will certainly be grappling with these over the next several weeks. For instance, this slide 37, we're getting together to look at the Zoom programs and provide recommendations to you. So, we're pointing them out to you today for any feedback or questions like you're asking. But certainly this is a complicated puzzle and it's going to change. The one thing we know for sure is that the puzzle pieces here are likely to change between now and the end of the legislative session. So as an example, the class size reduction program, it is proposed to be reduced in half in the governor's recommended budget, but we've already heard certain legislators point out, their feelings about that and their hope to restore funding for the CSR program. If that were to happen, either through the stimulus funding the state receives and how they might use it, or just greater revenue projections from the economic forum in May or what have you, if that's restored, then obviously you won't need to consider what to do about that program. And then that helps solve our deficit considerably. So it maybe doesn't feel early to you, maybe it does, but we are in fact kind of early in this ball game. Things will change. We have to prepare a tentative budget that you will need to see on the 30th that has to be submitted to the state by April 15th. But there's so many things that are going to have to play out between now and the end of May that we really wanted to put these as placeholders for you more than anything, so you can think about it, see what we're thinking about. We'll continue to do kind of budget analysis as well. So I just wanted to make that clear that we're not looking for any feedback today, and I don't think you think we are, but so much of this is just likely to change. So hold on to everything, and we'll come to you March 30th with leadership team's thoughts and recommendations, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you for the gentle reminder. It's appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Nicolette. Trustee Calvert?
I don't know if I'm asking this correctly or not, but once the ESSER funding is gone for a lot of these programs, is it possible to restore them, or they'll just be gone permanently?
Thank you for your question, Trustee Calvert. So, we would have to, when those funds are gone, we would have to evaluate if there's room or available funding for us to keep these programs going, or if they would go in the pot with other programs, and we'd have to decide, if we were looking at cuts, what would have to be cut.
Trustee Calvert, Dr. McNeil's going to jump in as well.
No, I appreciate that question, and that's one of the concerns that we have. Whenever you receive large amounts of federal funding, you always want to avoid that funding cliff at the end of the use of those federal funds. So this is very similar to the American Recovery Act, and we were very proactive on avoiding a funding cliff. And so with academic recovery, which we know, and we'll be talking about a little bit later in the regular board meeting, we know that academic recovery is not going to just take 1 year. It's going to be at least 2 to 3 years. And so the more that we can spread out the use of these significant federal funds at the district level, and then I would anticipate at the state level as well, the better off we're going to be able to be. And then when those funds leave, the district is in a much better way to support programs, whether through the general fund, other federal grants. But that's something that we really want to avoid, is that precipitous funding cliff.
Go ahead, Trustee Calvert.
Okay, so one more question, and maybe this doesn't make sense either. So then that would include a whole totally different budget at the time that we decide if we're going to keep them or if they're going to be gone forever.
So it depends on what funding source. So the ESSER funds are federal dollars,
Okay.
not the same as our general fund.
Okay.
And so that's what we're talking about today.
Okay.
But it could be that in order to help some of these programs and our budget deficit, we would be using, and that's one of the policy decisions that the board would have to make, some of those ESSER funds in order to help with that budget deficit.
Good.
One of the things, excuse me, that we're really looking at where that balance is, right, for all of us, is some of those programs that, because of the state budgetary restrictions and limitations that we have, that how much of those ESSER funds, which are really one-time short-lived funds, do we use to prop up some of the things that we can't do statewide, right now, because eventually those monies will be gone. And at what, which of those that do we think may have longevity that we may want to keep around, and how much is wise to do that with? How, maybe it's none, maybe it's a lot. So that's, all of those are the decisions that we're grappling with now at this point. And that's why having monthly budget workshops, I think, is really critical. So because every month things are changing. Every month things are changing, but as we get further and further really into the session, into the legislative session, and into getting a better idea of what the federal funding will look like, it'll give us a chance to be able to hone in more and more on what we do, and if cuts are necessary, and where they come from, and I mean where it's cuts from, and those levels of comfort we have around one-time monies and long-term monies from a funding standpoint. So this is a really critical time. A really critical time. Okay, thank you to my colleagues. You want to continue? Mr. Bazo, I think we're on next steps and timeline.
Yes, thank you. So going into our next steps in timeline, so similar to the last work session, we had presented strategies for closing the budget gap slide, and these steps are all dependent on analysis of the state budget, and if we continue down the path of the partially implemented people-centered funding plan, or if it goes back to full. But again, starting off with the budget analysis, continuing line item reviews, position and vacancy reviews, and reorganizations, and other analysis as well. And then determining the amount of general fund support needed from the federal stimulus. And then the next step here would be review of former categorical grant programs, so what we just discussed. And then, we show that going back to how much support is needed for federal stimulus funding for those programs. And then once we have that all figured out, we're still working on this plan, but putting together a whole plan of what's needed from federal stimulus, and then in addition, development of new programming for federal stimulus. So for academic recovery or mental health supports, those types of things. And then again, next steps. So we'll continue to analyze the governor's recommended budget and update you with what we find out there. Then the development of stimulus plan funding recommendations. So the multi-year plan for the stimulus funds. It's the 4-year budget we talked about earlier, with an emphasis on academic recovery, social emotional learning, and mental health. Will we need any of that stimulus funding for any of the GT or EL program recommendations that will come your way, or the support of existing general fund programs? And then, depending on what kind of, or after considering all these things, what deficit we're still looking at, we'll look at priority-based review of programs, and then consideration of possible service level reductions for central service departments. There's still a lot that can change, as we've talked about already in the presentation, but with the American Rescue Plan, or the 1.9 trillion stimulus plan, there's $350 billion for state and local governments, and the Nevada's state share would be just under $3 billion there. There's still questions to be answered of, will we continue down the road of partial or go into full implementation of the people-centered funding plan? And then if there is a partial implementation, does it look different than the current proposal? Also, I have a question from Trustee Church.
Thank you. Just to go back on slide 40, that central services, how do you define that?
Thank you for your question, Trustee Church. So those are non-school sites, so departments. What's at the admin building, facilities, transportation, those types of things.
Okay, Mr. Boswell, why don't we're almost at the end here. We'll go through that and then open it up for any other questions that any trustees may have, and in addition to, Trustee Church said he had several other questions, so.
Yeah, thank you, President Taylor. As we're still working our way through the COVID-19 pandemic and looking forward to, reopening schools in FY22, or what do those reopening plans look like? And then other unknowns, what does enrollment look like for next school year? We saw a significant drop in enrollment this year. We don't know what to expect, but we're projecting flat enrollment for next year. And then, as we briefly discussed earlier, how the Incline Village property tax lawsuit plays into our deficit. And then here, this is just a timeline of where we're headed. So we had this slide in our last budget presentation, and this one we added that in April and May, we'll be conducting a budget survey and virtual community forum, and that'll be focused on possible uses of federal stimulus funding. And again, we'll meet with you on a monthly basis throughout the rest of the budget process. And that will get us to the end for questions.
Okay. And again, just as a reminder for all of us, we're working on our tentative budget now. It's due in April. Our final budget, if it hasn't been approved by then, it's due end of May, early June. And we know that the session is probably going to still be ongoing until at least the end of May. And then we'll have an opportunity then to make any kind of changes or amendments to the final, I guess I can say final budget after the close of the legislative session. So I know we've asked a lot of questions along the way, which is great, because sometimes it's easy when things are this complex, really a lot of layers to the onion on this one. It's easier sometimes to ask as we go. But if there are other questions that people have that we have not asked along the way, then certainly let me know. And Trustee Church, you already mentioned you had some, so we're going to go to you first since I can't see you. So we're going to go to you first. Any other questions do you have, sir?
Thank you. I have essentially my list of 10. Let me go through them. I think probably all 10, and then we can go back. There are comments, but just like Jeopardy, they could be in the form of a question for staff to respond to. The first thing I'm hearing is, as you said, Madam President, that we're seeing many unknowns. The legislature, the federal government, enrollment, just more unknowns than there are known. So I understand that. I'll start with the most important recommendation first. We have something like 14 committees. I think we probably need an emergency temporary committee to assist staff in making these tough decisions. And I point to the audit committee that may have members that would volunteer since they're already in place. Mr. Doyle's an expert in many of these matters on that committee, but I think we need a committee. And that's not because we don't trust staff. They're doing an excellent job, and I've heard incredible things about Mr. Mathers in his prior life. So I'm not saying that, but I think a committee can make the hard decisions. And that leads to what was on slide number 40, number 2. I think we need to make cuts in admin before any cuts in education. That's got to be the first thing we cut, not the last thing. That was kind of an almost also ran on slide 40. I think that's got to be number 1 before. That can be cutting positions, that can be pay cuts, that can be 1 day a week furlough or 1 day a month. But we have to look at that, and that is what the committee would make the hard decisions. We can't, in fairness, ask Mr. Mathers to decide which of his people that he works with on a daily basis, should be furloughed or lay off. That's a very difficult thing to ask, and that's why, as a board, I think we need to make that. He used the term gut, leading to number 3, gutting education. I agree 100% with that term, because if you gut it, you can't resuscitate it. So that's why we need to, and I think we need to make these decisions now, not later. And so one other question, WC1 should be on the table for legislative relief. I'm not going to beat that horse anymore, but I've talked about it previously. And here's a big one, number 6. I think we need to stop building. Based on my calculations, just to ballpark, with the new schools that are already in progress, we'll be at 75% school capacity. So I think we need to really have a discussion on stopping the building. That'll save millions of dollars, not just the capital projects money, but all the other general fund money that assists in it, with staff, with teachers that we can't afford, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to have that didn't come up today. I think we need to have a robust discussion of the benefits of stopping building, paying off the debt, the interest-bearing debt. And that leads to the next question, which is a legal question. Can we use property tax or WC1 money if we have to pay off the Incline Village lawsuit? That's number 7. Number 8, I previously mentioned at a board meeting, I think we need tripwire or event-based planning so that we make the decisions ahead of time, not with emotion, that if a certain threshold is made, say we lose that IB Incline Village lawsuit, what do we do? Make that decision sooner than later. And number 9 is, and this came up, I call it the Monday morning newspaper. When you get that newspaper, you go online and you go, holy smoke, which isn't exactly what I might say, but holy smoke, I didn't know this was coming, that, nobody knew COVID was coming. So you always have those Monday morning news flashes that you have to plan for. At number 10, there is no number 10. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Church. I'm going to look to, there are a couple of those questions. I mean, obviously, there's some that could be for discussion. If anybody wants to make any comments on those, I think I will speak for myself in that I don't feel like I'm ready to make a decision on the budget at this point because there are just a lot of unknowns. Okay, that was for Heather. That was not for us. But yeah, at this point, I can just speak for myself as one trustee. There's still a lot more information to come and to be known. And because we have these meetings on a monthly basis, you know, we certainly aren't, I don't believe you push tough decisions down the road just because. We just need a lot more information. And if tough decisions need to be made, and some may need to do so, then we certainly make them. But there's a lot more information that can help me before I'm ready to make a decision. That's just my own response as an overall basis. In terms of anything that had to do with internal, I think I was going to look to you, Superintendent McNeil, on. I should have been writing it down. I was keeping them in my head, and the Heather announcement threw me off. Just in terms of commentary around staff recommendations.
So we'll bring forward to the March 30th. There are certain reorganizations that we're doing within the district as far as for central services and service delivery methods. And so we'll bring that to the March 30th. As you all know, this board has had to make very difficult decisions in the past, and central services has always been the one that we always go to first for making those reductions. But I will be bringing forward recommendations to move forward as far as for staffing for central services and the support for central service departments that are intricately needed for the support of our schools as well too.
Thank you, Dr. McNeil. I will also add that because I was here for the beginning, and some of us others were here as well, but certainly from the beginning of this, over the last 4 years, we've cut $51 million out of the budget, and the vast majority of that was outside of the classroom. So I actually think as a board as a whole, we've done a really good job of looking at what are those areas that we need to have efficiencies or make sure that we don't have fat. And then in some cases, we got down to where we got past fat and got to some things that really hurt, but in an effort to balance the budget for the first time in over a decade. And so I do think a lot of hard work along those lines have been done, and with great pains to do as much as we couldn't do, not as much as we wanted to, I don't think, but as much as we could to keep those cuts away from the classroom, because I think that's something that's important to all of us. Okay, other questions, comments of Mr. Mather or Mr. Bazo? I will say this, thank you so much for your work, gentlemen. This is a moving target, literally, week to week. And it's great to have such the full engagement of the board, because these are really tough decisions that we make one way or another, especially in the climate that we're in. But you're doing a great job of kind of keeping your arms around it to give us the best advice going forward. And then at the end of the day, one of our main responsibilities is our fiscal responsibility. It's absolutely our fiscal responsibility, and I wouldn't feel comfortable passing that on to anybody else. Clerk Manetto?
I realize that sometimes there's an appearance of surprise at something that came up, but really when we have people like Mark on our staff, I don't think there's really a lot of surprise, and I think they are always looking forward and making a plan, and that's just been my experience with this, our staff here. It's been wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Seeing no other comments, I do want to continue to encourage our trustees to ask tough questions. Certainly ask tough questions, because I think our constituents expect us to do so, and that's certainly incumbent upon us to do so. Okay, that being said, we're moving on further into the agenda. There is some public comment before we conclude our work session. JJ?
James Benton.
Benton?
Benton.
Benton.
The board also received an email from Nia Waters.
Thank you.
Mr. Benton, thank you for being here.
Good evening, Board of Trustees. I'm here to ask the board to look ahead to the future and set up a budget committee. As we've heard today, the committee has to deal with many large variables of income and spending. Already, the school board has many committees that are useful and helpful. A budget committee would be especially helpful because it would provide public input and advice. and help with taxpayers in understanding the budget and where the money goes. And it would increase public participation. Also, a committee could help provide long-term guidance and planning. Trustees come and go, but a committee could help give long-range planning. Also, they could evaluate the efficiency of money being spent, and this would be like by the public or an outside source. Also, they could help plan for fiscal gaps, study options, and predict shortfalls, and also be a group that, when needed, would support taxes. They could help inform people about the needs, how the money's spent, and garner support when needed. So for these reasons, I support the budget committee, not only in the short term, but the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benton.
That's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much. This should conclude our work session, our budget work session. We will have our 4 o'clock meetings, our regular meeting of the Board of Trustees right here. It will also be live, as you know. Thank you, everybody. Our meeting is now adjourned.